The public key infrastructure isn't a standard. PKI is more like an idea of how things ought to work. When we're talking about standards, instead we talk about two particular standards. Number one is the X.509 standard, which is basically a methodology that allows individual systems to query other systems that are storing things like certificates, for example. Secondly, how we actually organize the certificates, what certificates are used for, that type of stuff is under a standard called PKCS. So whatever those structures might be, they all kind of work the same way. Now, in earlier episodes, we talk about things like, for example, we have a certificate authority here up at the very top. The certificate authority generates their certificate. This is the certificate upon which everybody else who's using this is based on. Companies with names like Verizon and Komodo and Thwate, they all have some server somewhere with a root certificate. And man, is this root certificate precious. So a lot of times what we'll do is while we have a certificate authority at the very top which stores the root certificate, what we do instead is we have all of these intermediate certificate authorities that actually do most of the heavy lifting. This guy up here is often simply taken offline. That certificate is so precious that if someone were to hack it, well, we've seen situations in the past that were very, very ugly when that took place. So normally what happens is that the precious certificate is actually taken offline. So the certificate authority is handled offline and we save it to the intermediates to do all the hard work. So every time somebody's logging in, what they're going to do is they're going to query this guy and say, hey, we got a certificate with your digital signature on it. Is everything cool? And the ICAs will actually do the confirmation themselves. The other type of authority that you're going to run into, so we have the root authority, the certificate authority, we have the intermediates, but there's a third authority called a registration authority. Every web page on earth, every public web page on earth today has to be secure, which means it has to have a certificate and it has to use PKI. That means that the ICAs, which used to handle all the registration when you're setting up your first certificate for your new web server, they're getting too busy. So we actually have another type, I didn't make a block for it here, draw like this, which is known as a registration authority. And their job is simply to handle the registrations for people who are trying to generate new certificates so that they can get their server online. So what you end up having is, in this diagram right here, I've got a certificate authority and an intermediate, but you can have an intermediate of an intermediate. You can have an intermediate of an intermediate. This can go way down. It doesn't happen very often. But what you create is what's called certificate chaining. So there will always be a root. There's pretty much always going to be an intermediate. There might be a few intermediates, and then we'll have the actual web servers or email servers or whoever it is down here that actually needs the certificate themselves. So this is pretty cool to talk about in terms of how this all looks, but if you really want to see it, let's dive into a real certificate, and I'll save that for another episode.